Good evening. Last week we took a little bit of a break from our Through the Bible process and our prophets study to spend a little bit of time in Esther and kind of, to some degree, do a modified Purim enactment. But we're going to get back into the prophets this evening as we are now going to move into Daniel. Daniel is, again, one of the major prophets, what we call the major prophets. But there is something very unique about Daniel's placement, you could say, in the canon. And I'm just curious if anybody knows what that is. What is so unique about Daniel compared to the other, what we call the major prophets? Yeah, Joshua, what were you going to say? Okay, all right, he trusted God, but all of them trust God, right? Isaac, what were you going to say? The only one that tells a major story. Okay, it is narratively clear in the beginning, but that's not really. I mean, you get that from others, especially some of the minor prophets. Dave? Okay, we're going to talk about that there's a large chunk of it that was written in Aramaic and not Hebrew. And so we'll discuss that. Dale? Okay, so he is through the entire fullness of the captivity. You could kind of say the same thing about Jeremiah, who seems, although he kind of drops off the radar a little bit while they're in captivity. So, all right, I can see that. Anybody else want to take a guess? Yeah, here's the interesting thing as far as Daniel in the canon is concerned. Daniel is not one of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible. Daniel is in what's called the writings, and I think we've talked about this, the three sections, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And Daniel doesn't have a place, much like Esther. Esther as well is not in the prophets like the other history books. It's in the writings part of it, which is where the wisdom literature, the Chronicles, Ruth, and some of those other writings. Yeah, Bruce?
And Esther were from the same captivity?
Well, yeah. Yeah, Daniel is going to be a little bit earlier than the time frame of Esther. But it's not a chronological thing necessarily, because you have books that may be a little bit later. Although now that I'm thinking about it, I don't think Ezra and Nehemiah are in the prophets either. But it's just interesting. We consider it one of the major prophets, and yet it wasn't considered necessarily part of the prophets in the Hebrew canon itself, which was just very interesting. All right, now what have we seen with the other prophets so far? The major prophets, that is, we've talked about it with Isaiah and with Jeremiah. We begin by talking about what? I'm sorry? All right, Kelly said the types of prophecies, whether conditional, unconditional. Not really, that's not where we usually begin. We usually begin by talking about a very specific event to the prophet. his call, the moment that God calls him and says, you will be a prophet. If you remember Isaiah's call, what happened? Okay, cherubim touched a burning coal to his lips because God says, I need a prophet, right? And he says, woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips. So his lips were touched with the coal. What's that represent? Purification, right? His lips are cleansed so that he can use these lips to pronounce God's message. What about Jeremiah? Was someone saying it? Okay, yeah, it's the same idea, if I heard you correctly. But this one, it is God who touches Jeremiah's mouth. And again, a purification kind of an idea in order to prepare him to do the work that he's going to do. Therefore, what might we anticipate and expect as we are going to enter into another major prophet? Okay, we would anticipate God's going to call him, give him a message, and something's going to happen with his mouth, right? So we get into Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The Lord handed King Jehoiakim of Judah over to him, along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, put the vessels in the treasury of his God, and the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. And the king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine they drank, and they were to be trained for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to attend the king. Among them, from the Judahites, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names. He gave the name Belteshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. Daniel determined he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank, so he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces, looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days, and let us be given vegetables to eat, water to drink, and then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. He agreed with them about this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. And God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom, and Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. And at the end of the time, the king had said to present them. The chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. King interviewed them, and among all of them, no one was found equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they began to attend the king. In every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. That is Daniel's call, or at least the closest we can get to it. What's missing? Okay, God, what? A call, really, right? And which goes with God. Josie, were you the one that said that? Yeah, which goes with what Josie said. God does not come to him and say, hey, here's what you're going to do. Go out and do this. And he gives him a call of some sort and says to do this. It's not there, right? What else is missing? All right, some type of cleansing of the mouth, right? There's no, I am a man of unclean lips, and touch his mouth with something in order to purify it and to cleanse it. It's not there, right? So what do y'all think of that? What is there? Let me start with that. Okay, Dale said go ahead and say it again, Dale. Mike's right there.
He expressed his commitment to God, said he would not defile himself.
Okay. Wouldn't defile himself in what way? Bruce?
With his speech?
No. No, very specifically, what was it that he refused, Julia? Or is it Jen? I don't know. The king's food. In other words, he would not defile himself in what touched his mouth. Remember, it was the others who said, my mouth is defiled. With Daniel, he begins with, I will not defile my mouth. Can you see the difference between these two concepts? And maybe this is just a little bit of a clue to us that Daniel is just a different sort of person. And so when we talk about Daniel and Daniel's call, I'm probably going to say this later. I think that we get into this later, so we'll just talk about this again. But Daniel, as far as people who have a substantial amount of space within the scriptures, how many negative things are said about Daniel? Who can remember Daniel's kind of like his main fall story? Anybody? Yeah, Bruce?
Well, the people that he was in captivity with, they had a few negative things to say about him, but...
Yeah, but as far as God's concerned, where was his moral failing before God? Anybody remember? Hopefully you don't, because there is none, right? Out of all the people within scriptures that have a substantial amount, you can usually sometimes find something to perhaps nitpick in some kind of a way when there are narratives involved. And Daniel, he's pretty much immaculate when you comes through. There's nothing about him and his character spanning a great deal of time that we can point to and say, yeah, he was problematic. Notice the way that he is described, all of the young men. But when they're describing all of the young men, who are they describing? Not a trick question. Who's one of the young men? Daniel, right? And so when it's describing all of the young men that they're supposed to look for, these are those without physical defect, good looking, suitable for instruction and wisdom, knowledge, perceptive, able to serve in the king's palace. They would learn the Chaldean language and literature. So all of these things were characteristic. They're very specifically given to be characteristics of Daniel himself. So Daniel seems to be a person that perhaps doesn't have his lips cleaned because it's unnecessary to do so. He has demonstrated, how old is he when he comes to the palace? verse 4. Yeah, Kathy? Well, I wouldn't put an age to it necessarily so much as
He's young.
just he's a young man, right? This is a youth. This is a youth who has been brought by Nebuchadnezzar. And let's kind of get into some of this. Here's the span of his work as far as what we just read and looked at. He begins in whose reign? It's on the board. Thank you, Jehoiakim. Yes. He begins in the reign of Jehoiakim. Who's Jehoiakim again? Yes. There we go. Nailed it. First try. Yes. He is Jehoiakim's father, or Jehoiachim. So Jehoiakim's father. Remember, Jehoiakim is the one who was taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. His father, though, Jehoiakim, with the M on the end, he's the one who incited to some degree against Nebuchadnezzar. And so Jehoiakim, C-H-I-N, he's the one who's going to be taken off. We'll talk about that. He lasts until King Cyrus, and this is the one who gives the decree. Cyrus, is he a Babylonian king? No, he's a Persian king, right? And when I say Persian, who am I including in that? The Medes and Persians. But predominantly that empire is known as the Persian Empire. So he's a Persian, a Medo-Persian king. And we have a reference to the 3rd year of his reign. So we can put this to about 536 or so. And the most significant date, 605, is when Israel goes into captivity. And so when Israel was taken into captivity in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar came down, laid siege to it, and he takes these youth with him. This is when Daniel makes his way over. All right. Are we good with this? Do we remember this history? I mean, this should be kind of review. They get out of their captivity in 538. That's when the decree is made that allows them to return. All right, let's talk about Daniel the man. We just read everything that we know about Daniel as a person. What do we know about him? Bruce?
Well, he was brave. He was not afraid of the king.
Okay.
And he honored God by his loyalty to him. He didn't necessarily honor the king. He was just in slavery to him.
All right, very good. So his character, he had an impeccable character. He really does. What do we know about his family? Kelly?
Not much other than they raised a devout son who wasn't going to mess around with the foods of the royalty in case it wasn't kosher.
All right.
And they raised a boy that was probably going to be a leader of some kind, because that was the whole point of the king calling these young men in, was to take the upcoming movers and shakers, and teach them how to be his servants, not leaders of their own people, as an independent people.
All right, what made them upcoming movers and shakers?
They were good looking. They weren't defective. They were smart. They were teachable. They were the ones.
Hold on, Sean's going to help you out. Sean, just say it. Because they're part of the nobility. They have noble blood, royal family, and from the nobility. So they're part of the movers and shakers because of their lineage that they have, that these men are either from the royal family or they're from the upper echelon of society. Over here, Bruce, Jeff. They're from the upper echelon of society to begin with. And then, on top of that, as Kelly said, these are the ones who have the appearance and would be the people that are going to be followed. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
So they weren't commoners is basically what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, yep. These are definitely the future leaders. And this is a program set up to take the people that they know are going to be the next generation leaders, and you bring them back to Babylon, you train them to be pro-Babylon, and then that way, in a few years, you can do what? Send them back, right? To be the leaders that they're supposed to be. Send them back so they can take those positions, those high positions, and they will lead with what mindset towards Babylon? Yeah, go Babylon, right? They'll have a pro-Babylon mindset, which would have worked perhaps if what hadn't happened.
Medo-Persians?
Well, even before the Medo-Persians, did they ever have a chance to send these guys back to Jerusalem so that they could lead Israel as pro-Babylonian leaders? Man, you guys are dead tonight. What's going on? Am I just really boring? Why did they not send these leaders back to Jerusalem so that they could be leaders in Jerusalem and lead Israel to be pro-Babylon? Because Jerusalem got destroyed before they had a chance to do it, right? They didn't have the opportunity. 605 came while they're still in their training process, and everybody who's worth anything in, 597, 597, then 587, everyone's brought to a province in Babylon itself. And so that couldn't have worked at that point. Otherwise, that was what they were intending to do. Daniel has the type of character that he wins over every monarch that he comes into contact with. Whether it's Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, that you see, Darius or Cyrus, and all the ones that he comes into contact with, he has great relationships with. So that's the type of man that he is. Let's talk about the scroll itself. Daniel is just about the most bizarre scroll that you're going to find in the Old Testament. Why would I say that? Okay, first of all, it's written in 2 languages. All right, that's a really big deal, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. What else, though? Yeah, Bruce?
Well, the Israelites and the Jewish people were in captivity a lot, and this was just one more time, but he had some amazing things happen to him while he was in captivity. I mean, wasn't he thrown into the furnace?
Okay.
I mean,
Well, his buddies were.
Yeah.
And then, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were, yeah. And then, but he was thrown in the lion's den. We know those stories, right? And you know the stories about Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, right? We know what happens, with those stories. And so we've got some neat little narratives. But what else do we have in the book of Daniel? Prophecy, yeah. Yeah. Give me some more information about the prophecy. Okay. All right. The prophecy is apocalyptic literature. What is apocalyptic literature? Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Well, it's something. It's a It's literature in which something very dramatic and pivotal happened.
Okay. Yes, that's accurate. But more than just dramatic stuff taking place. What is it? What's apocalyptic literature? No, good try. Josie said literature that talks about the apocalypse. Okay, so that's a common thing, that the apocalypse, which goes with what Josie's saying, is about the end of times, end of days. Actually, what does the word apocalypse mean? The last book of the Bible is named the Apocalypse. Revelation, right? What is revelation in that context? Yeah, unveiling, revealing something that's been hidden. That's all apocalyptic literature is unveiling or revealing something that has been hidden, but it does so. By the way, Revelation is also a huge example of apocalyptic literature. Is it an easy read? No. What does it use? All kinds of symbolic language, symbolic numbers, visions, weird, bizarre visions of horns on a crown that start talking or doing various things, and all kinds of stuff. Yeah, you have these prophetic visions, but they're the prophetic visions that you step back and you say, what in the world is this supposed to be? And you scratch your head and you say, this doesn't even make any sense. I don't understand what's happening here. It's like the scroll of Daniel can't make up its mind, because on the one hand, it has these stories that are absolutely perfect to teach in the youngest of kids' classes, right? I mean, the youngest of kids' classes, you can talk about Daniel in the lion's den, and they love the story, and they get the message, and it's not a hard message. And it's not a message like, Jonah, where you're going to try to do something and mess it up. Or this is very simple. Trust in God, right? You have these narratives that are so simple to understand, and then you skip over on the other side, and what's on the other side? The most bizarre pictures and visions that leave even the great scholars scratching their heads saying, well, this is the best I can do with this. I mean, it has so much extremes to it. That really makes this incredibly bizarre. You have the introduction that's given. By the way, here, I'm going to outline right here. We have an outline here. You start with the introduction, and then you go chapter 2, verse 4, and the second half, all the way through chapter 7, and I just call this the narratives. And then you have chapter 7, verse 1, through chapter 12, that I call the visions. Now, what's weird about my outline? All right, say that again for the folks in the back. All right, Josie said, did you notice that? I've got chapter 7 in 2 different places. Why in the world would I do that? And why so specific to verse 4 in the second part of the verse? Yeah, Bruce?
Well, there's 2 different themes in the same chapter.
Okay. All right, so you have 2 different things going on with this chapter. Yes. Some of y'all have already kind of alluded to this. Or not just alluded, mentioned it. What happens in chapter 2, verse 4b? Okay, that's where, for some reason, the author switches to Aramaic and begins writing in a different language. It's Hebrew before, and then it switches to Aramaic. And how long do you think it lasts in Aramaic? If you were to take a guess. All right, maybe it goes through chapter 7 and verse 28. After which, it then switches in chapter 8 back to Hebrew. Now, chapter 7, though, how many of y'all remember what's in chapter 7, Daniel chapter 7? We've talked about Daniel 2 before, right? Remember talking about Daniel chapter 2 and the dream? What was on the dream in Daniel 2? Yeah, Isaac? Yeah. Yeah, that was the one with the big statue. Remember the big statue? And it had the head of what? Gold, the chest and arms of, all right, the belly and the thighs of, all right, and then the legs of iron, right? So it had all of these pieces in the dream. It was built upon, what was the base of it? This beautiful statue with all of these things, but it was built on what base? All right, what, Joshua? Okay, we're going to get to that. Very good, Joshua. We're going to get that in just a second. The feet were iron and clay mixture, right? And so the whole thing is built on a foundation. You know, the base of the statue, the feet, the most important part, is not a strong base to begin with. It's kind of brittle in that particular section, the feet. But the rest of it there, but as Joshua just said, there's a mountain. And from this mountain, you have a stone that's carved out. And then the stone that's not carved by hands comes, it hits it in the crucial spot here, crumbles the whole statue. And then this becomes a great mountain. So everyone remembers that picture, right? All right. What about chapter 7? Okay, another vision. What's the vision in chapter 7? The 4 beasts. And what do the 4 beasts represent? All right, 4 kingdoms. Just like chapter 2, right? So, there's, I think, a very good reason, and we'll talk about this in a second, to include chapter 7 in this section, from chapter 2 to chapter 7, not only because that's an Aramaic chunk, a different language, and it changes from there, but this language of the beasts in chapter 7 begins a long series or a series of visions for the rest of the book, with a notable exception. But these visions are going to describe the future in apocalyptic language as well. All right. Now, something very interesting that I think is happening in the Aramaic section, which sets it off from the rest, I believe there is a chiasm that is taking place in Daniel chapters 2 through 7. What's a chiasm? Anybody remember? Okay, it's a kind of parallel structure. It's like an inverted parallelism. And so we'll see it here as we kind of outline this. But if you look at Daniel, it begins with, we said, a dream of 4 kingdoms, right? What do you have in the next story? Very next story. What? All right, the fiery furnace, which is a story of God doing what? What does God do for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? All right, very good, Joshua. God delivers them. He saves them from the fiery furnace, right? And then you go into chapter 4, and that's all about what happening? Chapter 4 is all about what king? Nebuchadnezzar. What happens to Nebuchadnezzar? Okay, he loses his mind. A proud monarch is humbled before God. Move the page into the next chapter, chapter 5. What happens? What king is this one about? king, in quotations, right? Belshazzar. What happens to Belshazzar? Okay, the handwriting on the wall. In his own arrogance, he pulls out the things from the Hebrew temple and starts to use them. And so in chapter 5, a proud monarch is humbled, which brings us into chapter 6. And what's the story in chapter 6? Yeah, what's the most famous story probably in Daniel? When you think of Daniel, Daniel what? Daniel and what, Joshua? That's right. Daniel in the lion's den, he survives. Why is Daniel able to survive at night with the lions? Because God delivers him. And then this leads into chapter 7, which we just said is what? It's a vision, a dream that's given, a vision of 4 kingdoms. And so with this, you can see this chiastic or chiastic structure that goes from 2 into 4. And really, when you look at a chiasm, the most important aspect of it is usually the center part. And the center part is the humbling of a monarch in the face of God. I mean, ultimately, that's what this is all about, that God is able to humble the monarchs. And so, again, as we said before, all of this structure, chapter 2 through 7, are written in a different language from the rest of Daniel. He writes these in Aramaic, and the rest is written in Hebrew. It's as if he's being very, very deliberate to make sure that we see this is a section that is really important, and it's going to stand out. Plus, if this is being read beyond just the Israelites, that's the section that probably people are going to care about more than the rest of it anyway, right? Those are the ones that are the easier to understand and get something out of parts of the narrative. All right. Any questions on the chiastic structure of Daniel there? Yeah, Bruce?
Well, if he changed languages, wouldn't it have been hard for some of the people that didn't speak Hebrew to understand what he had written? I mean, it would be almost like, well, I'm writing to my people now and not everybody else.
Perhaps. Although I think people probably would have been able to determine what the rest of it is. They were pretty well read. People who were literate were very literate in multiple languages, typically. And Aramaic is very close to Hebrew. So it's not like they were trying to hide it completely, per se. But there's something to that. Yeah, Bruce?
Well, the reason I say that is because Revelations was almost written in so much symbolic language that people really didn't understand a lot of the symbology of it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's more the angle than a change in the language itself. Is yes, it's trying to hide to some degree the events from those who don't need to know them. All right, there are certain key themes, really just a couple, that I think I would like to bring out from here, and they both deal with God. First of all, God's sovereignty. How does God demonstrate his sovereignty in the book of Daniel? All right. First of all, the humbling of the monarchs, right? I mean, everything that happens, in chapter 4 to Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuchadnezzar comes out and says, "Look at all that I've done," and he's immediately humbled. And you have the same thing with Belshazzar, when his pride brings out the stuff from the temple. What was the second thing you said, Jan? Oh, okay. Yeah, he demonstrates his sovereignty through his deliverance. His great deliverances, which are just absolutely unbelievable. And if we were doing a study of Daniel proper and spending time with each of these, we'd talk about just how crazy it is that anybody could have survived a fiery furnace. That it's not even the people tossing them in survived that fiery furnace. And yet, here they are, the three of them, plus the one more who was in there with them. And the idea that not only does he survive the night with the lions, but I think one of the coolest parts of that story, what happens first thing in the morning? Yeah? What's that? Yes, yeah, in chapter 6, and Daniel's thrown into the pit with those lions. And by the way, tell me about those lions. Yeah, that was my next question. You just answered it. Well done. Yes. The lions would have been, I mean, these are meant to, this is an execution. So they're meant to be hungry and starved. And then they are silenced through the evening so that when you get to the morning, what happens? What's the first thing that happens in the morning? Yeah, Joshua? Yeah? Yeah. Say that into the microphone.
The king ran out to see if Daniel was okay.
Okay. Have you thought about how crazy that little tidbit of information is? Would anybody, under normal circumstances, after someone spent a night with those lions, walk over and yell down into there and say, hey, are you okay? Right? That doesn't happen unless they are conditioned by Daniel in such a way to say anything can happen with this person and this person's God. The deliverances are an indication of God's sovereignty that he has. All right. Just some important passages here to close up our discussion. Some of these we've already kind of talked about. Chapters 2 and chapters 2 and 7, which, remember, are parallel with each other. You know, in the chiastic structure, these are the two that parallel each other. These are visions of the four kingdoms. Why are these so important for our study, our journey through the Bible that we're going through? Why are these so important? All right. I was going to say, especially, you know, thought maybe some of you ladies might really pipe up at this point. How do we know when the Messiah is going to be here? Because God is about to stop doing what? He's about to stop sending prophets. He's about to stop his direct communication with the people, and he's going to let things ride. Has he ever done that before? Has he ever done that before? Kelly? Yeah, didn't he do the exact same thing when he made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then let things ride until such a time that was right for those promises to be fulfilled? He does it again. He makes very certain promises, gives to them, and then lets things ride for about the same amount of time, right? Until it's time for those promises to be fulfilled. But he gives them a timeline to some degree, at least something to follow, and he says, here's what to expect. You've got these parallel passages that let you know there's going to be four kingdoms. And at the time that the fourth kingdom comes, that's when you can start to look for deliverance to come. That make sense? So, Daniel becomes incredibly important for us as we trace our way through what we call the silent years, the intertestamental period, the Second Temple period, whatever name you want to give to that. Daniel chapters 2 and 7 help us. But we've talked about that. We talked about chapter 2 before. Everyone remember that discussion? Where I drew up a better version of the king. This one's my, real quick one that doesn't look good. The other one was where I had it all detailed and nice, because I think I added a crown on the top of it. So that was the really nice version. We also talked about chapter 5 already, haven't we? Honestly, I don't even remember the context why I brought it up, but I know we talked about. Anybody remember why I brought up the writing on the wall? I don't think we were talking about Daniel yet. I think it was something else. Yeah, Kelly, do you remember?
It was with they were messing around with the stuff from the temple.
Was I just going through the history of the time period?
A couple months ago when you were telling us what was coming.
Okay, so I was just doing the history aspect. Okay, all right. Well, that would make sense why I would do that then. Yeah, Bruce?
Well, weren't they having some sort of a feast?
Mm-hmm.
And then the writing started to appear on the wall?
Yes. Yeah, that would be
Right?
that would be the night that Babylon fell. Is what's talked about in chapter 5, Daniel chapter 5, with the writing. And there's a great feast, and whether they have the feast because they believe that they could never fall, or they have the feast because they know that the fall is inevitable. Whichever one is the case, they have this great feast. They bring out the articles from the temple very specifically to make light of Israel and their God, and that's when the writing on the wall takes place. All right. Let's turn to chapter 9, though, because I think Daniel chapter 9, and we are in the midst of the visions section, but like I said, there were some exceptions. It wasn't all just straight vision, 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 vision. Daniel chapter 9, I think, is a key and important passage for Daniel to remember. Daniel chapter 9, first verse, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, a Mede by birth. And I've heard a very good argument that this is referring to titles, not specifically names. So we're not talking about the son of Ahasuerus in the days of Esther, which would have been way past Daniel's lifetime. So just trying to make sure that we clear that up. But verse 2, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the books, according to the word of the Lord, to the prophet Jeremiah, the number of years for the desolation of Jerusalem would be 70. So I turned my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and petitions with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. And then he begins to pray. Why? What's he talking about? First of all, Jeremiah. What does that have to do with anything? All right, remember it was in Jeremiah that you had that Hananiah guy who's like, guys, settle down, it's only going to be 2 years. And then Jeremiah is like, no, it's not. It's going to be 70 years. Remember Jeremiah wrote to the folks in Babylon. Jeremiah chapter 26 or 29. I think it's 26, which means it's probably 29. He wrote to them and said, hey, settle in and make your life as good as you can make it for the community that's around you, right? So, it's really important, I think, to understand these people knew about each other. Daniel knew about Jeremiah. I think he knew about Ezekiel. Ezekiel obviously knows about Jeremiah. Jeremiah, I think, knows about Ezekiel. But you have interaction between them here where Daniel's reading Jeremiah, and it says, hey, in 70 years, what's going to happen? You'll go back to your land. By the way, what's that? I'm sorry. Well, But the calamity, all the calamity came for them, right? Which put them into captivity, which is where they've been for 70 years. And so, go ahead. What verse were you looking at again? Oh, 13 in chapter 9. All right, very good. Yes, just that is written in the law of Moses, this disaster has come upon us. Yeah, and right in there, again, just you're like spot on, like right where I'm going with all of this. That's great, because this is what Daniel's doing with this prayer, is he is going to God in penitence. He's going to God saying, we're sorry. And basically he's saying, you were completely just in bringing all of this calamity upon us, in destroying the temple, destroying the city, bringing us out here, but it's been 70 years. What is he reminding God about? He's saying, you promised you would bring us out. And by the way, if you read after the blessings and the curses in Deuteronomy, you come, remember the blessings, the curses, 28, 29, you get into 30. What does it look like when you get into chapter 30? What does the return look like? Just take a guess. Are they supposed to kind of slink back, and just kind of tail between their legs and come back and just kind of live in an area? No, the promised return is supposed to be glorious. It's supposed to be great. God's supposed to bless them with blessings far better than what they've had before, right? And so this return takes place, and what hasn't happened yet? There's no glory to their return in 538. It's been 70 years, and they go back, but the story's not done. And you can see Daniel saying, this isn't what I envisioned. By the way, when we start talking about Nehemiah, this is a really important point. Why does Nehemiah get so upset in his day? This is what it's all about. Because the return was supposed to be one way, but that wasn't the reality. And so you have Daniel, and the wheels start spinning, and he says, well, we should be back, things should be good. All this calamity that God brought upon us, that should be erased by now, and everything should be hunky-dory, but it's not. So who does Daniel blame? Does he blame God? Does he say, God, you haven't done what you're supposed to do? No, this is the statement made just a second ago. Mea culpa, right? It's me. This is my fault. And what's interesting about Daniel saying, we? Okay. Not only did he not, Kelly said he didn't have a whole lot to do with this. Not only that, but what do we know about Daniel? We spent a lot of time. What were we talking about him earlier? Okay. Daniel was a really righteous guy, wasn't he? He was not defiled. He was not unclean. He kept himself spotless. He did all the right things. And then Daniel turns to God and says, well, obviously, something is wrong. Something is making it to where our return is not the way that our return is supposed to be. And if there's a problem between one of the two parties, he says it's not God, it's got to be us. That's the wheels that are turning in his head. And so he turns to God and he says, I'm sorry. We are sorry. And that's what this prayer is all about. 17, therefore, well, let's go. 13 was mentioned just a second ago, verse 13. Just as it's written in the law of Moses, all this disaster has come on us. And we still have not sought the favor of our Lord God by turning from our iniquities and paying attention to your truth. So the Lord God kept the disaster in mind and brought it on us, for the Lord our God is righteous in all that he has done. It's we who are wrong. We have not obeyed him. Now, Lord our God, who brought your people from the land of Egypt with a strong hand, made your name renowned as it is this day. We've sinned, we've acted wickedly. Lord, in keeping with all your righteous acts, may your anger and wrath turn away from your city, Jerusalem, your holy mountain. For because of our sins and the iniquities of our fathers, Jerusalem and your people have become an object of ridicule. Therefore, our God, hear the prayer and the petitions of your servant. Make your face shine on your desolate sanctuary for the Lord's sake. Listen closely, my God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolations and the city that bears your name. We're not presenting our petitions before you based on our righteous acts, but based on what? Your compassion. Again, Exodus 34, right? It's an appeal to God, who is merciful, compassionate, slow to anger, who does judge, but his judgment lasts for what at most? Third or fourth generation. But his loving kindness, his continued love and loyalty to his covenant lasts through the thousands of generations. And it's in the midst of this that he gets a message that says, oh, I've heard. And I've got something in place that's going to make all of this will then make sense. And that's when he starts talking into all these things where you have the 70 weeks and that whole discussion. And, you know, we could have all kinds of discussion, except we don't because we're out of time. And that's kind of purposefully so we don't have a long discussion on what the 70 weeks are or any of these other things. The main important point is to know this. What is Daniel ultimately, or what is God ultimately referring to? In which all wrongs will be put to right. Yes, Joshua.
I'd say a prophet.
What?
Jesus.
Jesus. Nailed it. That's exactly right. All of this is pointing to Jesus. And it's important that we understand that is what Daniel's accomplishing. All right, questions or comments as we close it up this evening? All right, thank you for your participation. And I will turn it over to Richard. Thanks a lot, guys.